The story of the UK is an economy that has got real momentum.
What is broken can be repaired. What is ruined can be rebuilt.
UK inflation is becoming much more homegrown.
We have huge potential as an economy in the UK.
This is a time to tell Israel there is a path to peace.
Our plan for the British economy is working, but the work is not done.
Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Yuan. Now, Caroline, I want to start the show getting our teeth into a big political issue, and that is dentistry.
Oh my gosh, you're pulling out Christmas cracker-worthy jokes. You should get a plaque. All right, let's drill down into dentistry then.
All right, enough puns now.
Okay.
It's actually quite a serious issue. The Nuffield Trust says that NHS dentistry is at its most perilous point in its 75-year history. To quote the report today, full universal access to NHS dentistry has probably gone for good.
Wow, that is a huge conclusion. The Nuffield Trust says that radical action will be needed in order to prevent further decline, either through further means testing, major reforms to the dental contracts that exist, or both combined, plus a very large injection of funds.
Another call for money on another public service. Well, Labour have done some surveys of dental surgeries on the scale of this problem. It says that in 245 constituencies, that's more than a third of the total, there are now no NHS dentists who will take on adults at all. So no dentist across the entire constituency will take on adults who aren't already on their books.
Look, I think this is absolutely staggering. I mean, I've been reading about just how many Brits are going abroad for dental care, you know, to cheaper places like Turkey. There was a massive drop-off in dentistry during the pandemic, of course, because a lot of the dentists had to close. There has been a rebound since then. But if you read this Nuffield Trust report that is really eye-watering, you realise that actually we have not returned to pre-pandemic levels. And the people that are suffering the most in terms of lack of dental care and intervention is children and also the most vulnerable people in society. That's according to Nuffield.
Yeah, and you read some really, really horrible scare stories, don't you, of people doing teeth extractions themselves. Really sort of stuff that really just makes you wince. Look, I think this is a problem which hasn't been going on for years. It's been going on for decades, and it's almost as if when they set up the NHS, they decided that looking after your mouth and dental care was somehow not really intrinsic to the body, which has always struck me as rather odd. And there's always been a kind of view that dentistry is sort of extra and you can sort of pay more for that. So NHS should be free, except when it comes to your teeth, and then you have to pay. And I've never really understood that distinction. And I suppose no government wants to kind of grasp that nettle.
Well, I think that is shown up by the fact that actually, if you drill down into the data, you realise that there is actually an underspend in terms of the units of dental care that the NHS pays
is that right?
for. It is right. If you look at the Nuffield figures, there's an underspend. Why? Because that money is then used to shore up other parts of the NHS. But it's also, it's a really complex issue, just like social care, just like so many other issues that the government needs to deal with. It's very difficult. The charges for dentistry are growing well above inflation. You've got persistent inequalities in terms of access, a lot of regional differentiation between access, plus, of course, not enough dentists being trained. It's just a lot of problems that have built up over many years.
Yeah, and of course the sort of central problem, not to reduce it to something simple, but the central problem is that dentists earn a lot of money and they're not willing to do work for the rates that the NHS wants to pay them, which are often quite low. Well,
this is also because of the combined contracts, right, where it's one dentist who does both private and NHS work. But look, the pushback from government is that, they say the Conservatives will take the long-term decisions to improve access to dental care with 6 million more dentist appointments and the Conservatives building a brighter future for the country. I mean, they are right in the sense that there have been 6 million more dental appointments, but obviously it comes off the back of that pandemic low in terms of, the lack or the great reduction that we saw in dental care over that period.
Yeah, and a big problem with access in lots of parts of the country.
So you heard that phrase there from the government's response to the issue around dentistry of making long-term decisions. I mean, we've heard that sort of repeated again and again from Rishi Sunak. But accounts from the business department, again for something that took place during the pandemic, show that a number of long-term bets that were initiated by Rishi Sunak when he was Chancellor have not paid off.
Yeah, they actually lost close to £300 million. The Future Fund, which was set up by Rishi Sunak when he was Chancellor, the Treasury actually called it the brainchild of Rishi Sunak. Those are their words. Made more than £1.1 billion of investments into startup companies during the pandemic.
The problem is a number of them have gone sour, and our senior economy reporter Philip Aldrick has been writing about them. Phil, well, a sex party firm, a cannabis products company and a lower league football club. I suppose these are eye-catching. And some of the investments pretty eclectic. It's fair to say that they didn't go the way that Rishi Sunak might have wanted.
Not yet. I mean, I suppose a venture capital portfolio, one or two are supposed to make 100 times or
Right.
10x or whatever. So maybe one or two will come good. But at the moment the valuation. So the accounts for the business for BEIS, I can never remember what it stood for.
The business and energy and
industrial strategy. That was it. Yeah, and it's been changed. It's now split in two, and so
it's not called
Department
BEIS
for Business
anymore,
and Trade now so the accounts for 2022-23 showed that basically they have an independent external valuer who establishes the value of the portfolio.
So this is the Future Fund and how much it's worth. All of those investments in different
exactly.
businesses.
So 1.14 billion was invested in 1,190 companies, and it's now worth 851 million.
So it's lost money.
So it's lost close to 300 million. I think it's close to 150 companies are insolvent. So have definitely
failed.
They're dead and gone. There have been some companies where they've cashed out. So it's hard to work. It's hard to tell whether they've cashed out with a profit or whether they've just cashed out and taken the money and whatever they could take and run. But it looks like they cashed out and had some losses. And then there's been, so the Future Fund was the way it worked was that it was between 125,000 to £5 million for each company was the amount of money provided. It had to be match funded by a private investor. So the government or group of private investors. So the government felt secure in the knowledge that this did have separate backing. It wasn't just doing it on its own, and they were convertible loans. So originally it was it's just a loan, and it converts to equity at the point in which somebody else invests. So you get a new investment round. But what seems to be happening is that the convertibles are coming through, and the valuation that they're getting converted into equity is significantly lower than the actual debt that was provided through the convertible loan itself. Basically these you've got to remember that these investments were the ones that were not attracting venture capital money in the pandemic because it was an emergency scheme. So if you were a venture capital company and you thought company A is a great tech startup, you would put your money in that, but maybe you would have had a little bit more credit, and but because of the pandemic you couldn't get access to the cash, so you didn't put it into company B. And basically what we got in the Future Fund is we're invested in a whole load of plan Bs, and so the idea that there's going to be some 10x or whatever in that type return company seems there may be a few, but not that good. And remember,
so fading hopes then, basically.
Yeah, it feels
So what, the government tried to help in the pandemic. I mean, venture capital is very risky, but did the government bet on the wrong horses, or what happened?
It's a strange thing because actually it started off as a £250 million scheme, and then it became a £1.14 billion scheme, venture capital scheme. And I think, and basically Rishi Sunak was very personally invested in this. He definitely saw UK startups as quite an important area, and to his credit, I mean, a lot of these companies would have attracted some kind of investment round, but these are not tech bro companies like Bolton Wanderers, a third or fourth division, football league club is not what you would. I think Tom Rees, our colleague, it's his home team, and he says it's 134 years old. It's not a new venture. So
yeah, and the idea also is it's not going to deliver enormous economic growth to the whole country, or potential growth.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think they have looked at fraud, so I don't think there's many any examples of fraud in there. It looks like they've estimated. I think Bezos estimated about £6 million of fraud losses, but it seems to have been quite bizarre in as much as the qualifying process allowed sort of any sort of small company, family-owned company or whatever, to be able to access this support. And so but we have to remember, in the grand scheme of things, these were, pandemic was obviously an extreme period. The startups were particularly vulnerable because there was just no cash available for companies which were not generating any form of profit. So and revenues were pretty weak. But also then there was all the bounce back loans. Then there was the C-bills and whatever. So it was part of this kind of package of measures to help the businesses survive. And 80 billion was extended on all the loan schemes, and Bay's accounts also showing that there was an estimate of about 11 to 12 billion of losses on that. So in the context, 300 million, a quarter of the portfolio, down a quarter of the portfolio, that is a worse result than 11 billion out of 80 billion on the bounce back loan schemes. But I mean, these are higher risk ventures.
This fund was administered by the British Business Bank, wasn't it? Which is also central to the government's plans to beef up our pensions by investing in higher growth companies. Do you think that we should be concerned that the BBA is the BBB rather is involved with this?
No, I think basically the British Business Bank is the sort of administration process, centralising administrative operation for. They've got things like British Patient Capital, and they don't actually. They're not a bank, despite their name. They don't have their own balance sheet. What they do is that they administer state money and put it with like other venture capital companies through the British Patient Capital stuff, or get it invested into infrastructure or wherever their particular priorities may be at that point. I think obviously that as their role, it makes perfect sense for them to have been the sort of conduit for all of this money. Obviously, with the loans schemes like the bounce back loans, those were actually. British Business Bank was a sort of administrative process operator, and all the money went through the banks themselves. Barclays, HSBC, NatWest, Starling. A lot of money went through, and obviously it had all these government guarantees on them. So that's why the losses are coming through for the state.
Phil, it's a really interesting piece and fascinating analysis that you've done for us. It's on the Bloomberg Terminal. Our senior economy reporter, Philip Aldrick, there. Thank you so much.
Now, it may be the last day of Parliament for the year, but the PM will not be chilling out and wrapping his presence today. Rishi Sunak faces the Liaison Committee later today. Senior MPs will quiz him on a number of topics based around key themes. Well, joining us now in the studio is Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo. Now, Tiwa, this happens 3 times a year, doesn't it? It's probably not something that the PM's looking forward to. Just remind us what the Liaison Committee is exactly.
Yeah, well, if Rishi Sunak thought he could close up shop for Christmas, he's definitely not there yet. Liaison committees are really designed to scrutinise the government. So, when you go for the final round of a job interview and you're faced with a panel of very important people, that's the parliamentary version of this. In short, the pressure's really on, and it might be some uncomfortable questioning for Rishi Sunak, given that his government has faced its fair share of challenges recently. He's going to have to muster up the strength to face the committee after what's surely been an exhausting year. The committee is made up of some very expert and senior MPs who chair the select committees in the different areas of government. Select committees, of course, are designed to check and report on the work of the government relating to specific topics. So they're highly specialised, and the Prime Minister will be questioned by them for around 90 minutes. So it's going to be a very detailed inquiry.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, It really is the sort of firing line for PMs. We certainly saw that under the Boris Johnson tenure. And also, I think that there's been quite a marked change in the Liaison Committee in terms of how much they prepare and sort of sequence the questioning. It's led by Sir Bernard Jenkin now, but Harriet Baldwin's on there. She's a regular on the programme, isn't she? What do you think the Prime Minister is likely to be asked about then at this event?
Well, the committee has released some official documentation talking about the topic areas that Rishi Sunak will be questioned on. So those are split into global issues, economic issues and energy, focusing heavily around the recent COP28 conference. But of course, nothing is off limits. As I mentioned, these MPs represent every area of government work. So we should expect a very broad scope of inquiry. But when you think about the potential questions that could come out of those areas, it reads like a sort of worst hits for Rishi Sunak of the last few months. I mean, under global issues, there's the Israel-Gaza conflict. There's also the controversial plans of the government to do with migration, the Rwanda plan. Under the economy, they could be talking about benefits, reforms, and, of course, those famous 5 key pledges, which are the Prime Minister's own measures of his success. It doesn't help that so far he's only definitively kept his promise to halve inflation. Of course, the other pledges include things like growing the economy, making sure the national debt is falling and combating illegal migration. So I'm sure that the committee will be keen to quiz the Prime Minister on how he's getting on against those targets.
Well, Rishi Sunak, of course, is somebody who likes to say he's very much across his brief. He describes himself as a details man. I think it's probably fair to say he's got a very different style to his predecessor, but one. Boris Johnson had some very sticky moments at the Liaison Committee, not always across all of the details. Do you think Rishi Sunak's going to have all the answers today?
Well, Rishi Sunak is a details man, as you mentioned. I'm sure he'll have done his homework. But some of these questions might actually just be unanswerable. It's certainly going to be tricky. And if we take Rishi Sunak's recent performances in Prime Minister's Question Time, where, of course, Keir Starmer has asked him about a number of these issues, one might say that he'd struggle. I mean, if we take migration, for example, just last month we heard that the ONS has revised up migration figures for 2022 to 745,000. That's angered many of his own party, and that's coupled with all the controversy of the Rwanda bill. The government is, of course, still trying to get those deportation flights off the ground. It becomes very difficult to see a way through those questions, and we might see him start to squirm a little bit.
How important do you think his performance is, though, overall?
I think that the Liaison Committee is one of those crucial moments for a Prime Minister where their performance could, in fact, be career-defining. It's hard to forget those scenes of Boris Johnson from last year under very heavy questioning as members of his cabinet were quitting left, right and centre. I think it was described by some media as a humiliating finale. So, of course, that's contributed to our lasting image of Boris Johnson and his premiership. So it's something that is very important. And coming, of course, at the end of the year, it will maybe be how people judge Rishi Sunak's 2023, and we'll stick with him going into the beginning of next year.
I also think that that is very true point. The other question, of course, is the composition of that liaison committee, because even from his own party, there are different factions who sit on the liaison committee. So there could be, questions from all sides to the Prime Minister, but also from the different factions within the Conservatives, which may actually be quite fascinating.
Yeah, and these are the most kind of senior of senior, aren't they? It's kind of like the grilling of grillings.
Yeah, absolutely.
It makes Prime Minister's questions look easy.
Tiwa, thank you so much for being with us. That is Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo.
Now on the show, we like to bring you up to date with some Bloomberg news items. Does the name Ever Given ring any bells? Now, if it doesn't, I'll remind you, it was the massive ship that ran aground and blocked the Suez Canal 2 years ago. We talked about it endlessly. It had loads of implications for global trade, and that ended up knocking up prices around the world. The incident actually disrupted £7 billion of trade in goods every day.
Well, 2 years on, ships are avoiding that volatile and difficult region again, this time because of attacks on ships travelling near Yemen, the Bab el Mandeb Strait, which, of course, forces linked to the Israel-Hamas war, to Houthi rebels who are firing at ships from bases in Yemen. Just as Rishi Sunak was hoping that inflation would come down, we might actually end up looking at a burst in the cost of shipping and therefore the cost of goods, frankly, that we all buy anywhere in the world, but particularly in Western countries. The UK today has announced that it is part of a new maritime task force aimed at patrolling the region. And Lizzy Burden and I were speaking to retired British Navy Rear Admiral Chris Parry about this and just talking to him about how serious the threat is and how this rapid reaction force is going to behave, whether it's going to solve the issue or not. Have a listen to Chris Parry.
I think what we have to appreciate right up front is the sea is the physical equivalent of the World Wide Web, and it links every country to globalization. And so these attacks are not simply on ships that are associated with Israel or indeed the free world. They are associated with the whole international trading system. So just like when you get a ship stranded in the Suez Canal or any other maritime choke point is put under pressure like this, it affects practically every price, particularly on the energy and commodities markets. And what's really significant about the Bab el-Mandeb, which is the strait that's off Yemen, is that most of the energy supplies for the free world tend to go that way through the Suez Canal. So that has an effect on our prices in the free world. But what it doesn't do, of course, is have an effect on prices in China or any other Eastern country. So quite clearly, this is a strategy by Iran. They've put the Houthis up to this to put pressure on the free world system to affect decisions about support for Israel. It is not simply the Houthis acting on their own. Iran is behind this.
But what do we need to know about the capabilities of the Houthis here?
Well, the Houthis have been growing a capability mainly based on Iranian and Chinese weapons. What they have is they have drones. Everybody's got drones now that can attack things, as you've seen in Ukraine and also in Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict. They've also got ballistic missiles, which are those that go up into the exoatmosphere and come down again. They're quite difficult to counter. And they've also got anti-ship missiles. They had a go at an American warship recently, which promptly destroyed the launchers. The balance of capability is overwhelmingly on the side of the free world navies. And I suspect soon that America in particular, but I think the whole Western alliance is going to lose patience with the Houthis. And I suspect we'll see some strikes on the land against the Houthi capability and also perhaps their command leadership as well.
Yeah, in that case, what do you make of the US, UK, Canada, France, this naval task force then? So what sort of actions do you envisage them taking, and how quickly, if there is action against Houthi points within Yemen, how soon might that happen? It's been building over the last few weeks.
Well, this sort of rapid coalition is not untypical of maritime forces. It's the sort of thing we put together to counter Somali pirates. If one goes back a bit further, it's how we countered the Iranian attempts to close the Straits of Hormuz, put pressure on tankers there. At the moment, I think the operation will be restricted to ensuring that those merchant ships that want to go through to the Suez Canal past Yemen, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, are safe to do so. You mentioned yourself that quite a lot of companies, BP, Maersk, others have rerouted around the south of Africa. That has an effect on their bottom line. It has an effect on the world economy bottom line. So we don't want to put up with that for too long. But I suspect unless the Houthis decide that actually it's not in their interest, you're going to see a very rapid strike probably before Christmas.
Recently in Georgia, a Silk Road forum about the Middle Corridor, and I imagine they'll be rubbing their hands at the prospect of an alternative trade route, but it doesn't seem like that's going to be a permanent, viable option if this is going to be resolved quickly.
It's a really good point. And what we have to do is see this as part of the strategy of Russia, China, Iran to develop their Eurasian economic, military and strategic networks. And anything that can disrupt the free world's use of the oceans will help the Eurasian autocrats to be able to do that. And I think people tend to see these sort of things in terms of regional or local issues. They're not. They're part of the grand strategy that is seeing these Eurasian autocrats of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea essentially confronting and basically seeing if they can test the patience of the free world and, of course, its ability to move goods, commodities, and information around the global space.
That the US is mulling military action against the Houthis. What are the risks of that? Because that is also what we've spent many weeks discussing, of a wider conflict within the Middle East. And what are the other chips that would be involved in that sort of action were the US to go down that road?
I think, as I said, right now, it's a defensive posture to make sure the Houthis can't actually strike anything in the Red Sea and around the Bab el-Mandeb. If the Americans and their allies, and I should stress it is their allies as well, we've all got an interest in this, do seek to strike the Houthis, it will be a precise surgical strike, very much like the ones against Syria. If you remember, when Syria had been using chemical weapons, it'll be an ability to say to the Houthis, you're actually out of your box at the moment. Here's something to think about. You're out of your depth. If you try it again, we'll hammer you again.
Well, that's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Wilcock and our audio engineer was Max Green. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Yuan Potts. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.